All right, well, we'll go ahead and just jump in. Yeah, so like we said, attribute rules are something that I've started learning more and more about with my involvement with, I'm working with the State Information Technology Services Office, looking at next generation 911 data readiness throughout our state. And one of the things that we're using to help us really make sure we have really good, clean data is we're using a modified version of Esri's addressing solution. So that's something you may look into as well. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, I don't cover it really in this talk, but I can send out some more information or put a link in the chat or something. So yeah, today my whole goal really is to just let you even know attribute rules exist. Talk a little bit about what they are, how they are different from ArcMap's attribute assistant, then go over the anatomy of the attribute rule viewer, touch on Arcade, and then talk a little bit about the different types of attribute rules and a few simple examples. So to get started, what are attribute rules? So really, these are just user-defined rules that help you automatically do things like populate attributes or maybe restrict different things that your editors can do. You can perform different quality assurance checks on your different features. And this is something that you would consider like complementary to something like using domains and subtypes. And here I did highlight that these are, rules are tied to a geodatabase, an enterprise geodatabase or a file geodatabase. They do not work with shape files. So you do have to be using feature classes for these attribute rules to be applied. And I just showed kind of a graphic here that shows you where your attribute rules are. There's a number of ways to get to an attribute rule. You can either, when you have a feature class in your table of contents highlighted in your data tab, you'll see I've highlighted, circled with red, the attribute rules. And also if you would right click on a layer in your table of contents, it's in the same as, I think is where you would find your domains as well. You could open up your attribute rules view. So some of you might be familiar with the attribute assistant and are wondering, well, what's the difference and are they interchangeable? And the attribute assistant is only available in ArcMap. It's an add-in that you had to manually install. You had to configure these two tables, a dynamic value table and a general ID table. If you wanted to keep track of your errors, you had to set up log files, and it comes with 71 predefined methods. And I'm not super familiar with attribute assistant as much, and I'm not sure when they mean configure if you can only use these set rules and you can't really like create your own custom rules. But one of the nice things about attribute rules is they're super flexible because you're using Arcade. And attribute rules are built right into ArcGIS Pro, so you don't have to download anything. And there aren't any tables that you're required to fill in. Attribute rules are tied directly to the feature class that you're working with. And you can set it up a couple different ways, but errors will pop up automatically if something has happened. You've fired an attribute rule and something went wrong. Error messages will pop up, sometimes with something that you would consider a clue, but I don't know if you've ever seen error messages from the Esri product. Some of them are a little bit generic, and that happens as well, but it should at least let you know which attribute rule is failing, and it might tell you why. And all of these attribute rules are configured using Arcade expressions. And you cannot use attribute rules in ArcMap or Attribute Assistant in Pro. So if you configured a feature class that has attribute rules tied to it and brought it into ArcMap, I think it's still usable. I just don't think anything will happen if I guess they would just like be disabled. I've never tested that, but that's my assumption. I would think you'd still be able to use it, but this could be a good test if you are still working in a shop that uses both ArcMap and ArcPro. I would definitely want to test that out if you're having multiple users editing that data. So to talk a little bit about the anatomy of an attribute rule view. So, when you click on that attribute rule button, this is what's going to pop up. And this is specific to the feature class. So for example, if you have an addresses feature class and you open up the attribute rule for it, all of these attribute rules are only going to be applied to that feature class. So it is pretty easy to copy and paste or to import rules. So if there's something you want to apply to multiple layers, you'll have to set those up individually. So in the top here, you can see there are 3 different type of rule types, and we'll talk more about those in a minute: calculations, constraints, and validation. And then you can see there's this, where your rules are listed and in what order they're in. On the right-hand side, you'll give your rule a name if you want to give it a short description of what it does. If you want to tie it to a specific field or a subtype, you can set that up here. You can also set up if you want your editor users to be able to edit a field outside of using the attribute rule. So just like going into the attribute table and just editing themselves. And then you have your expression window. And, this is the heart of attribute rules. So, knowing how to use Arcade is pretty important. But there's plenty of resources out there. Then you have your error section where you can configure, you can give it a number and some sort of a message. I usually use pretty generic ones like, uh-oh, something went wrong. But if you can spell something out to give people more of a clue, depending on what your attribute rule is configured to do, that could be really helpful. Then you have the trigger section. And so an attribute rule can be triggered in 3 ways: by inserting a new feature, updating an existing feature, or deleting a feature. So, that's really cool, because if you only want an attribute rule to be triggered when somebody deleted something, that's pretty awesome to kind of have that kind of power. And then you have your execution settings, and we're going to talk a little bit here about these a little bit more. So order is really important with your rules, because if you think about it, it's kind of a chain of events that happens. They don't fire all at one time. It kind of matters, what your trigger rules are. But if you're using one attribute rule to configure one field, and then later, down your attributes list, you're configuring, another attribute rule tied to that, but you need to have whatever value is coming from this first one, it matters. So that's something you'll have to think about when you're setting up your rules, is in which order you're kind of having those set up. And that'll probably make more sense when you start doing it. Again, we talked about if you're going to allow your editors to be able to edit within that specific field, just in the attribute table or not. So really you can say, I'm only going to allow values to get into this field using the attribute rules. I'm not going to let you just go in and change it on your own outside of that. Error messages, again, here's an example. So if you look, and it's a little bit small, but if you look in the highlighted red part, it's telling you that the rule name, so job status last edit, and so at least you know what's happening. And here their error is something about, work order technician cannot be blank. And so it's giving you as many clues as you've set up or it can to be able to remedy what's happening so that that rule will fire appropriately. Also, I've noticed that if you have your attribute pane open, and as you're editing that, if there's going to be a flag because a attribute rule won't fire properly, that should also show up there as well. Triggers, again, setting the editing event that the trigger rule triggers the rule. So be thoughtful about this when you want a rule to be triggered. And with the execution settings, so this exclude application evaluations, this has to do really with like being able to see the effect kind of locally before you send it to like the back end. So you can see the change. So I think about like if I opened up the attribute pane and was making edits, let's say I have an attribute rule that calculates something on a field a couple down from where I'm entering some values. You could see that happening before you kind of like finish and print, push enter, I guess, to make that official. And I've seen that for attribute rules, sometimes it kind of forces you to make a decision on that, or you can only do one or the other. So I just kind of ran with that. Something else to keep in mind is you don't have to run attribute rules necessarily right away, like right on insert, delete, or update. You can do batch checks. And that really means that this allows your users to go in and make a bunch of changes and edits and be filling in data. And then at a specified time, they will run the rules. And then you can come back with these error layers are created, and you can look at those using the error inspector or using the evaluate rules tool. I haven't done that yet, but if that's something that you wanted to use for your QA process, just know that that's available. And then there have been times when being able to disable an attribute rule is really helpful. So there's been cases where a good example is with the solution that we're using for this next generation 911, there's a rule that will split a road at different boundaries. Once you've created a line, it will fill in specific information on either side of a boundary. And there's been times where we're still questioning where that boundary is. So I'll disable that rule before I bring data in so that it's not automatically splitting anything before I'm ready for that to happen. And if that rule is only set for something like insert, that means if you bring the data in, and that's disabled, if you turn it back on, it's not going to automatically just happen to those unless you did something like an update to it. So Arcade, if you haven't used Arcade, I suggest you become familiar with it. It is, a proprietary, I don't know if proprietary is the right word, but it's only used in ArcGIS Esri products. So this is an expression language. So, if you've done anything with something like Python, you should probably be able to pick it up pretty quick. I think it's fairly intuitive. They have really good resources online. One thing that's really good about it is consistent across all the different platforms, desktop, web, mobile. I haven't tried to use attribute rules in the web, but I believe you have to have probably your own ArcGIS Server Enterprise setup to be able to do that. I don't think they roll up to ArcGIS Online when you do hosted features. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong there at the end, but I don't think it's compatible with ArcGIS Online. So, know also that you're going to see Arcade in other places that's really powerful. So when you're configuring pop-ups, you can use it. In your field calculator, you can now use Python or Arcade. If you're going to be doing any sort of custom labeling, you can use Arcade. Dashboards, field maps, all these using the API for JavaScript are all leaning on Arcade as well. So it's a good language to get under your belt. And again, like I said, there's lots of examples out there. And so many times, whatever you're looking for, if you just Google it, somebody else has probably put it out there somewhere. So to talk a little bit about the different types of attribute rules, there's three kinds: calculations, constraints, and validations. Calculations, this is something that you will set up so you can automatically populate an attribute's configuration. So a few examples. If you want to generate a unique sequential ID, you can set that up so you don't have to come back and recalculate that later. And that will ensure that you're not going to have any kind of duplicates in that ID field. You can do concatenation, so you could take text from different string fields and push them together, merge them into a different text field. You can add values from one field based off of the input of another field. You can set up things like intersecting. You want to pull out information from intersecting features. So, for example, if you had a point and you wanted to be able to automatically populate what county it's in, you could set something like that up with a calculation rule. So here's an example, and I'm sure that this is hard to read, but I just wanted you to get kind of a sense of what arcade expressions look like and the things you can do. So in this example, it's showing how you could calculate the full address by concatenating several street address field values. And so here, you're just taking the different parts and merging them together using this concatenate function. Here's another example where we've taken using a spatial point in a polygon query to add the ESN, that's emergency service number information, to an address point. So every time you would insert or probably update a point, this arcade expression in the rule would say, I'm going to tell you what the ESN number is, pulling that out of whatever polygon it's probably falling in, using the intersect function. Another type of attribute rules are called constraints. This doesn't populate the attributes, but is used to ensure that different conditions are met. It returns a Boolean true or false. If the constraint is violated, you're going to get that error message. So examples here is making sure that a string is all uppercase or a feature doesn't have empty geometry. There's one set up to bring back a custom error message. In this example, it's actually preventing a feature from getting deleted. So this is actually a really great one. So instead of just making a whole field read only, that's another option, I guess. You could make a field read only and then, do a calculation or something. But here it's saying, if the life cycle status field does not say retired, you cannot delete this feature. That's pretty powerful. Last type is for validation. And I haven't used these ones a lot, but it's used to check features in your data set based on specific requirements and constraints, but doesn't prevent editors from being able to complete their work like the constraint rules would do. And I think that these are mostly used for batch instead of triggers at insert or update. So evaluations do occur at a user specified time. So this would be, maybe something you could run at the end of the day and you could spit out an error report or something like that to help with your data flow and quality assurance checks. So here's an example of a substation exceeds the maximum KVA. I don't know what exactly a KVA is, maybe some kind of energy measurement, flag this as an error. And so that would allow you to, flag all the ones that don't meet your thresholds and go back and make edits if you would like to. Here it ensures that if a pole is higher than 65 feet, the material, so probably, the value in a different field would be, has to be steel. And so just really being able to set up, all of these different checks to ensure you have the best quality data. So that's kind of all I had in a nutshell. I wanted to put up some resources that are really powerful. Keith, I don't know if you send out the slideshow, but you're welcome to. Otherwise, I'd be happy to just email this resource list. But to get a little bit more familiar with attribute rules, that Q&A is actually really helpful for just some of us, how do I get started? Why are attribute rules different than the attribute assistant? They have a great Learn ArcGIS tutorial that you can go through that could be really a good way to get familiar with using those rules. And then I have some different resources on Arcade. And in the GitHub one, there are expressions that people are adding based off of different rules that they've already created and are sharing out with anybody else who wants to use them. So I'll go ahead and take any questions if we have any.